Okay, let's try this one more time. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is the Lincoln Assassination Conspirators and Booth Escape Route Tour. Thanks so much for being here, and happy Sunday to all of you. My name is Robert Kelleman, and I will be your host. And this is part two of a two-part program we're doing on the Lincoln assassination. So part one was a few days ago, on April 14th. We talked kind of about the overview of the Lincoln assassination and then did kind of a virtual walkthrough tour of Ford Theater. If you missed that program, you can find it on our YouTube channel, which is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. If you're watching the program live, the link for that recording is in the email I sent out that had the Zoom information for this program. If you're watching the recording of this program at some point in time in the future, you can just go to our page and look for the part one program, which again was kind of overview of the assassination of Lincoln and a tour of Ford's Theater, kind of a virtual online tour. This particular program, though, we're going to be talking about the conspirators and the escape route that John Wilkes Booth used to try and escape from his crime that he committed. This program is kind of like an online or a live stream version of the in-person tours that we do at Ford's Theater. These have been on hold for the past couple of years because of COVID. With things starting to open back up, we'll probably continue doing these at some point in time in the near future. So if you're watching us live, you can be on the lookout for that. That'll probably take place hopefully sometime later this summer. And the reason why we're having the programs this time of year is because Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14th, and he died the following morning on April 15th. So every year around this time, we always have a lot of Abraham Lincoln programs, including this year. So thanks so much for joining us. Okay, so before we talk about the Booth escape route and his attempts to get away, let's just do a really quick, brief overview of some of the things related to the assassination we talked about in the previous program, in case you missed that one. John Wilkes Booth was a famous actor. He was also a Southern sympathizer, and he had very extremist political views. He was a racist, and he really blames Lincoln for the misery and the suffering that the South is enduring during the Civil War. And so that's the reason he is motivated to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. He has a whole team of people that are conspiring with him. Now, not all of these individuals were directly related to the assassination, but many of them were. And these are people that share Booth's Confederate sympathies. This is the escape route. I like this map that's been put together. I didn't create this myself. Here's Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was shot a little bit after 10 o'clock on the night of April 14th, 1865. It just so happened to be Good Friday. And then this is the escape route that Booth attempted to use to get away from justice. And so you can see he travels through Maryland. If you're not familiar with the geography of Maryland, it surrounds Washington, D.C., here in this red box. So Booth flees south with one of his accomplices, and then eventually he crosses the river here, and he makes his way into Virginia, but he's finally cornered by the Union cavalry and was killed on April 26th of 1865. And so what you can do, if you either live in the Mid-Atlantic area or you're going to be visiting, what you can do is you can pack up your car and you can go travel this route and check out all of these sites in person. And so that's something that our group has done. We've gone on this bus trip to go check out these sites on numerous occasions because of COVID. Thought we would do an online or a virtual program so you can see what it's all about. And then hopefully when things return to normal, you can go check these sites out yourself in person. Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Of course, this is where Abraham Lincoln is killed, murdered by John Wilkes Booth. who snuck up behind Lincoln while he was sitting in the presidential box and shot him in the back of the head. Booth then gets out of the presidential box by jumping from here all the way down to here. And if you're kind of wondering, how did John Wilkes Booth get caught? What I did for some of the slides, I put a big blue star by the ones that are really important as far as him eventually getting captured. So this is the first thing that's really significant in Booth's capture, is when he jumps out of the box. The spur that he was wearing, a spur is a metal device that you would have on your boots to help you ride horses. The metal spur that he was wearing at the time got caught on the American flag. And when he jumped down, he didn't land cleanly. He landed awkwardly, and he ends up breaking a bone in his leg, which really slowed down his departure from Washington, D.C. So you can really say that this is one of the first things that leads to his capture, the fact that he broke a bone in his leg when he tried to jump out of the presidential box. And so you could say that Booth is tripped up by the stars and stripes. So that was the first significant thing that happens. And then he has to escape. If you remember the map that we saw earlier, he wants to get to Virginia, and there's still a lot of Union troops that are guarding the entry and exit points into Washington, D.C. at this point in time, even though the Civil War is kind of winding down. It's not completely over just yet. And so there's a lot of troops around. And so here's Washington, D.C., and Booth has to get across the river over here to Maryland so that he can continue his journey to get out of Washington, D.C. This is that area of the river in kind of more modern times. So you can see it's pretty far across. And so I'm showing you this photo to give you a sense that, you know, you would not be able to swim across this river very easily. You could probably do it if you had to, but you definitely wouldn't be able to do it very easily with a horse. And of course, during the Civil War, there's boats patrolling this area and all kinds of soldiers and things like that. So he has to get across, and he decides that he's going to do it by crossing one of the bridges. And this is a photo of the bridge that Booth used to get out of Washington, D.C. This is a Civil War era photo. So if you can kind of imagine Union guards stationed on either end of the bridge, and anyone that approached was asked to identify themselves, indicate why they needed to get across the bridge, particularly in the evening. They would have been more on guard. So, but you can see this is a pretty great distance. And there weren't a lot of bridges outside of Washington, D.C. at this point in time. Washington, D.C. is surrounded on two sides by rivers, and there were not as many bridges available during the Civil War era as there are now. And so this is the one that Booth chooses to use. And he gets stopped by one of the guards. There was a curfew in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War, and you were not allowed to cross the bridge late in the evening. Booth is trying to cross the bridge after 10:30 at night, which was forbidden normally during wartime. However, the guard that he encounters, Booth starts interacting with him and basically kind of sweet talks the guy. Maybe the guards were a little more at ease because Robert E. Lee's troops had surrendered a few days earlier. So the guard duties might not have been quite as stringent as they had been a few days earlier. So Booth approaches the bridge. He comes in contact with the guards, and interestingly enough, the guards actually let him pass, even though they were not supposed to. That was in violation of a rule that was in place. And then one of Booth's accomplices, David Harold, he also approaches the bridge, and guess what? He's also able to get across. And so really kind of miraculous, the two of them, they were traveling independently at this point in time. The thought being that they would meet up at Mary Surratt's Tavern, or at somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Mary Surratt's Tavern. If you're wondering what happened to the soldiers that let Booth and Harold through, there was an inquiry into their the performance of their duties, but they didn't get it in any trouble. It was just kind of considered to be a just kind of an oversight, so to speak, and not realizing the significance of the fact that these two gentlemen were trying to travel across the bridge. Of course, news travels much slower back then than it does now. So the guards had no way of knowing that President Lincoln had been assassinated or shot. He had not been killed. He had not died at this point in time. He was still only just shot, although he would die a short hour later. And Booth and Harold are on their way to a site called the Surratt House, which is in Clinton, Maryland, and it's a site outside of Washington, D.C. It's southeast of Washington, D.C., and you can go check this out. I really highly recommend you visiting this site. It's a location that's closely associated with not only John Wilkes Booth and David Harold, but also the controversial Mary Surratt. So let's talk a little bit about that. Mary Surratt owned a boarding house in Washington, D.C. And if you saw the first program that we did, we talked about how her boarding house really served as kind of like the planning and staging area for the Lincoln conspiracy or the Lincoln assassination. And so Mary Surratt has this boarding house in Washington, D.C. She also has another property southeast of DC, a place known at that point in time as Surratt Tavern. And so again, here's the pathway that Booth took. And he's on his way. Booth was familiar with this area. Someone will probably ask, why didn't he go this way? Because he would have already been in Virginia. The reason being is twofold. Number one, he was not very familiar with that part of the country. He was very familiar, much more familiar with this section. So even though Virginia is right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., Booth chose not to go that way partially because he wasn't familiar with this area, number one. And number two, this area was under, in my opinion, much tighter kind of Union military control than this area was. And so I think he also believed that he would probably encounter less troops if he went this way than if he went that way. So this is his first destination, Surratt Tavern. And Lincoln is shot on or about 10:15 on Good Friday evening, April 14th, and he makes it to Surratt Tavern a little bit after midnight. So he actually made pretty good time. Now, if to go back to the river crossing, had he been stopped there, it's interesting to kind of wonder what would have taken place then. I don't know if he really had that figured out himself. The assassination was kind of like a spur of the moment decision that he had only decided to do several hours before. So had he been stopped at this bridge and not allowed to cross, who knows how history would have turned out. So that's an interesting kind of fork in the road, so to speak, pun intended. And if you want to visit this site, I think a lot of people in Washington, D.C. don't realize how close this house is to the city. So if there's no traffic, which there usually is traffic in Washington, D.C., but if there was no traffic, you can really get to the Surratt House. It's only about a 30-minute drive. So you can see here's where Ford's Theater is. And if you were traveling by car, you could go this way. Now, if you make this route during rush hour, then this might take 2 hours or maybe even longer. But if it's on the weekend or something like that, you can easily make this trip in 30 minutes. If you're familiar with the DC metro system, they don't have a metro stop out by the Surratt House, unfortunately. So you'll have to get there by car, most likely. Although people periodically travel by horse. And here it is, the historic Surratt House and Tavern, built in 1852. So again, before COVID, we made this trip on a regular basis. I think maybe like a couple times a year, we'd rent a bus and a group of us would go down and check out these Lincoln assassination sites that John Wilkes Booth was connected to as part of his escape. But because we haven't started our bus tour back up again, this will be kind of like a live stream or online or a virtual trip instead. Let's see. Oh, and so this program is kind of like a part history program and then kind of like a part travel presentation, just to give you those two things put together. At these sites that we're going to be talking about, a lot of them have different historical markers. I'm not going to stop and read every single word on every single one of these markers. I'll pretty much explain the things that are discussed in the historical markers. But if you're visiting by yourself and you're not able to listen to this program on your phone somehow, you can always read the captions there. Now let's talk about Maryland and the Confederate sympathies that it had during the Civil War. This is the election of 1860, and Abraham Lincoln, he captured 59% of the electoral college vote. He only captured 40% of the popular vote. That was more than any of his competitors, but it was much lower than 50% of a majority. So this is the election map of 1860. You can see Lincoln, so Republican, he won the states in red. He had 3 competitors, and you can see this is where things played out for them. And let's talk, though, about the state of Maryland. So these are the 4 gentlemen that were running for president. And John Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat, he actually won the state of Maryland. Lincoln did not win the state of Maryland. And I like to point this out because I think for most people, they just kind of presume that Abraham Lincoln was really popular throughout the what was known as the United States during the Civil War, not counting the Confederate states. But that's actually not the case. Maryland was a border state. It was also a slave state, and Lincoln was not popular there at all. You can see the election of 1860, he got less than 2.5 percentage points of the popular vote. There were only 2,294 people that voted for him out of over 92,000 votes. So Lincoln not popular in the state of Maryland, at least not in 1860. Now, Booth's initial plan was to kidnap Lincoln. We talked about this briefly in the first program, so we won't rehash all that. But the initial plan was for Booth to kidnap Lincoln with his team of co-conspirators, somehow get him down south to the Confederacy, like to the capital in Richmond, and then use him as a bargaining chip, either to exchange for Confederate prisoners of war that had been captured, or who knows, maybe they could even negotiate with the U.S. government and get an end to the war. So Booth's initial plan was to kidnap Lincoln, not necessarily to assassinate him. And so while he's in the planning process, he ends up visiting this area of Maryland, this southeastern portion, this southeastern location outside of the capital. And so he had been here on numerous occasions. He ends up meeting some of the people that would come and join his team of conspirators. And so this is how, partially how he becomes familiar with this area. And so when he's going to be traveling through here after he shoots Lincoln, it makes sense that he would go through here because he was familiar with this route. And this is the Mary Surratt Tavern. So this is what it looks like in more recent times. And so after the assassination, the thought was that Harold and Booth would either meet up at the tavern or they would meet up on the way to the tavern. It just so happened that they met on the way to the tavern. They were traveling down the road. There was not many other people on the road. You have to remember it's like 11 o'clock at night on Good Friday. This is a very rural area even today. It was even much more rural back then. And so they end up crossing paths, so to speak, on the road to the Surratt house. And then Booth and Harold show up here to pick up some supplies. And here's what the tavern looks like today. It's got this very distinctive red color. And again, this is a different property than the Mary Surratt boarding house in Washington, D.C. I'll read a section of this historical marker, which is outside. It says, owned and operated by the ardently pro-Southern Surratt family, this building was used by Confederate agents as a safe house during the Civil War. Again, even though the state of Maryland is part of the United States still during the Civil War, there's a lot of Confederate sympathies there. Built in 1852, the structure was a tavern, a hotel, basically, and a post office. Mary Surratt's son, John Jr., a Confederate courier. So Mary Surratt's son was a Confederate courier. He was transporting messages from Richmond to points north in Maryland. He also was very familiar with this area as well, which is one reason why Booth wanted to get him onto his team, because he had Confederate sympathies and he's also familiar with this area. And the thought was by Booth that he could help him kidnap Lincoln. Booth planned to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, and Surratt was to help convey Lincoln to Richmond. The tavern was to serve as a way station during the kidnapping. Weapons and supplies were secreted there or stored there. And this talks kind of about some other details about the tavern. Here's that map again, or a similar one to it, and then that photo that I showed you a minute ago. And here's the house or the tavern in more recent time, again with a very distinctive red color. And I don't think that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. realize how close this is to the city, or maybe people that have not been to the Mid-Atlantic. I kind of, as a boy growing up, I kind of pictured this house being like, I don't know, a long ways away from Washington, D.C., so to speak, but it's actually not that far at all, at least not in terms of geography. If you need gas on your way down there, you can stop at the local Citgo. And there's another view of the building. And one of the things I like about this program is they have a lot of living history programs. So like, for instance, this gentleman is one of the historians. So show up there, they'll give talks or have different programs about this structure. I like this particular site because not only does it give you the history of the Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth situation, it also talks about what life was like just for regular everyday people that were living in Maryland during the mid 1800s. The town was so small, the Surrattsville, Maryland, you can see the sign here. Again, it served as a restaurant, a hotel, and the post office all in one. Surrattsville, of course, was Mary Surratt's name. So the town actually took its name from her family, her husband's family. And here's the inside. So when you go there, what you probably want to do is call ahead of time and tell them you're coming so that you can find out when they're going to be having, like, say, their tours or the historical programs that they might be doing that day. If you're going to be visiting, you might as well take the time to let them know that, hey, I'll be here, or I'll be there at 11 o'clock on Saturday. Can I schedule a tour? Because this is a pretty small site and there's only so many people working here. And so if a bunch of people show up all at the same time and they can't accommodate all of them, you might have to wait around, which could be challenging. This is kind of the main work area, so to speak, for the administration of the hotel. So this would kind of be like the equivalent here of like when you check into a hotel, they have the counter here, and and back here is the post office section of the operation, and then over here is kind of the bar part of the operation as well. And so what would happen is the mail would get dropped off in bulk, and the employees would kind of separate it by family. So, okay, this is the Jones family, and this is the Smith family, and et cetera, et cetera. Then they have drinks here. So if you showed up after a long, hard ride in your horse or your carriage, you might be a little bit thirsty and want something to drink. They could accommodate you with that. And here he is sorting out the mail. Now, some of the programs that this site and most historical sites or museums have these days are kind of in a state of flux because we're still getting through COVID. But before COVID, it was just really neat to go here and have the staff members kind of talk about their job and how they ran this place and what life was like at this point in time, and kind of all the little interesting historical aspects and tidbits of this operation. So again, not just learning about John Wilkes Booth and his escape attempt, but also just kind of what was life like back in this part of the country in the mid 1800s. These pictures that I'm showing you, most of them are from tours or trips that we took out here. So this gentleman was giving us a talk one day. You can see here they have the sign-in book, which Booth and Harold did not sign in because they didn't spend the night. And then slavery was legal in this area during the time up through most of the Civil War. So this is a reward poster for runaway enslaved persons. So they have different things like this on display that aren't necessarily related directly to John Wilkes Booth and his escape attempt. This is a famous portrait of Mary Surratt here. This is the main kind of entryway. The door is right here, and then you can walk down this hallway. There's the famous portrait of her, Mary Surratt. Very controversial figure. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And here's our historical reenactor. And it's really beautifully furnished. It's neat to go into a place like this and just see all the antique furniture and photographs and fireplace and just knickknacks on the fireplace mantle and the rugs and things like that. So this was the parlor where people would sit and kind of hang out. And then this was interesting. I wish I had a recording of this, but he was talking about meals and like the different types of food that they would eat, both for themselves and then also for their guests. So I thought that was really interesting. And then here's the food setup. This food, of course, is fake. You can't plop down there and take a bite of turkey, unfortunately. And then this was also interesting. So the women here were talking about how the food was prepared and just kind of all the different aspects, kind of comparing and contrasting that with how food is made today. So that was also really fascinating as well. So again, I really just liked the aspect of learning how people lived back in the mid 1800s. So they did a great job. There's another view of so this would be the kitchen area and food cooking over the fireplace. This stove type contraption. And the period clothing. Now, this is when you go upstairs. So this is the main bedroom or the master bedroom. And when Booth and Harold visited here, they didn't spend the night. They had previously been here. And initially, as the historical marker said, they were going to use this kind of like as a safe house or a place to store supplies that they might need, or who knows, maybe they even would have taken Lincoln here had they kidnapped him. So they were familiar with this place, and they end up stopping in here because when Booth and Harold are escaping Washington, D.C., they traveling very lightly. They don't have a lot of stuff with them, so they had to come in here. They picked up a rifle and some food and some alcohol and stuff like that, and then they went on their way. But they weren't here for very long on this particular date. They had been here previously, but on this particular night, they were only here for a few minutes. This is one of the guest rooms. And then this is the attic. So utilizing as much space as possible. And then just an example of some of the different programs they have. Of course, a lot of school groups come here, and they just have a lot of different things going on. This was an event where Lincoln impersonators showed up. So you're not seeing things there. And then they have a nice museum that has a lot of interesting exhibits about things related to this site. So this one is called The Saga of Mary Surratt and all the different things that she was involved in. This is a model of Ford's Theater. This is a model of the spot in Washington, D.C., where the Lincoln conspirators were executed. And I thought I would do this. Let's play a quick video about this site and so you can learn more about it. Hold on for 1 second. I just have to tweak something.
It was a family home, a tavern, a post office, a hostel, and even a polling place. But those aren't the reasons why thousands of people visit Surratt House Museum every year. Its involvement surrounding one of the most renowned assassinations in history, the killing of President Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth, is why Surratt House, an ordinary mid-1800s plantation home, lives in infamy. Located in what is now Clinton, Maryland, the house gives a feel of what homes were like during the Civil War era. Though the kitchen wing has been rebuilt, the home still has the original flooring and several items owned by Mary Surratt, the former owner of the home, who became the first woman hanged by the federal government after being convicted as a conspirator in the Lincoln assassination plot. The home was a Civil War safe house for agents of the Confederate underground and soon became involved in the kidnap conspiracy that led to Lincoln's murder. It was the first place that Booth and his accomplice stopped while fleeing Washington, D.C. after killing Lincoln. His leg broken during his escape from Ford's Theater, Booth stopped at the tavern for some whiskey to ease his pain and to pick up supplies for his escape to Virginia, which included a gun which was hidden in the attic a month before as a part of the original kidnap scheme. After Booth was killed in a showdown 12 days after the assassination, a hidden gun, which Booth left behind, was discovered by authorities. It was lodged in the wall between the kitchen and the dining area. During the investigation, authorities cut through the wall to retrieve the rifle, which became a key piece of evidence in Mary Surratt's conviction. In 1976, the museum was opened as the first public historic house museum in Prince George's County. With tours available Wednesdays through Sundays, Surratt House Museum still tells the story of desperate times and desperate deeds during the American Civil War and gives a glimpse of what life was like during that era. So please, visit us at Surratt House to get a glimpse of yesteryears and to learn more about the conspiracy which changed the future of America forever.
Okay, that was a nice video, so I wanted to show that to you. This is from their website. Now, there's a really cool film called The Killing of Mary Surratt. And what I was thinking of doing was screening that later this summer. I was going to do it around the anniversary of the trial. So some of the trial stuff we'll save for that program. It'll be kind of like, I don't know, part 3, I guess you could say. But we're going to do that later on this summer, probably like in early July, because that's the anniversary of the trial. So you can be on the lookout for that. As far as Mary Surratt, she's a really controversial figure. Quite a few people think that she was innocent, and then quite a few think that she was guilty. I'm not afraid to admit I've researched this case pretty extensively, and I think she was guilty. If you think that she was innocent, that's fine. You have that opinion. There's quite a bit of facts, though, that point to her being involved in the Booth conspiracy. So we'll save some of that discussion for a little bit later. I was thinking maybe what we could do is we could have maybe like a poll, and we could have people vote whether or not they think she was guilty or innocent, but we'll save that for later on this summer. All right, so the next stop that Booth and Harold made was the infamous Dr. Mudd House, which is in a place called Waldorf, Maryland. And here is Dr. Samuel Mudd, one of the well-known figures of the Booth conspiracy, just because he's such a very interesting individual. So again, here's our map of where they're traveling to. So they leave Washington, D.C., they go down to the Surratt House. They only stay there for a short time, just a matter of minutes, because they realize that the Union military is going to be on their heels rather quickly. So they leave there, and then off they go, continuing south. Now, Booth had been to Dr. Mudd's house, and so he was familiar with this area as well, but it's very dark at this point in time. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, remember, when Booth tried to get away from Ford's Theater, he tripped up as he fell, breaks a bone in his leg, and so he's in an extreme amount of pain, and more pain as the evening more pain as the evening wears on. I would imagine probably initially adrenaline was probably kicking in, but over time, as he's riding on a horse, I don't know if you've ever been on a horse for an extended period of time. It's nice to go ride a horse for 30 minutes or an hour, but if you do it for several hours, that's actually really physically taxing if you're not used to it, especially if you have a broken bone in your leg. And so he needs to stop and have his leg treated. He was not probably initially planning on stopping at Dr. Mudd's house. What he was probably going to do is just go down this way and then cut across here down this road. Of course, it wouldn't have been an automobile road at that point in time, but there was a road there. So he probably would have gone this way. But when his leg, the pain in his leg, is getting to be so excruciatingly difficult for him to ride, he realizes he's gonna have to get some kind of medical treatment. He knows Dr. Mudd, they're not best friends or anything, but he's familiar with him. So he decides to instead go there and pay him a visit. And this is also really a key point that ends up getting him caught, the fact that he stopped at Dr. Mudd's house. I wanted to show you a Google Maps aerial photo of this site. Reason being is so you can see how rural it is. So this is a photo, Google Earth from recent times, and look at all this green space here. So this is farmland and trees, and the Lincoln assassination was, of course, a long time ago. So if it was very rural when this image was taken, you can imagine it was even much more so during the time when John Wilkes Booth was passing through here. And another thing that's noteworthy about this site is if you ever go through this area in either the early morning or the late evening or in the middle of the night, it's really dark out here. So you might be kind of familiar with going through like the suburbs or the cities, and there's, McDonald's is open 24 hours and 7-Eleven and street lights and stuff like that. They don't have that out here. It's really, really dark. So this is a photo of give you kind of a sense of that. If you're wondering what this area looks like at night, I actually have a photo image to give you a sense of what it looks like at night. So here's a picture of what this area looks like in the middle of the night, around the same time that John Wilkes Booth would have been traveling through here. There you go. There's the photo. No, not just kidding. It's not really a photo, but it's really dark out in this area. So Booth actually gets a little bit lost on his way to the Dr. Mudd house. Because imagine it's a lot harder finding something at night when this area is so dark. And of course, there's no street lights. He can't type in the GPS coordinates in his iPhone. He can't call AAA and ask them for assistance. So it does take him a while to get to the Mudd house. He actually gets a little bit lost, but eventually he makes it there. And this is another site that you can go visit. So kind of the same thing with the Mary Surratt house. You probably want to call ahead of time and tell them you're coming and then find out when the tour is. The reason being is depending on what you're doing, if you're just going to be leaving Washington, D.C., or maybe Baltimore, and you're going to be just visiting the Mary Surratt house and the Mudd house and then turning around and going home, the timing maybe not as critical. But if you're trying to see all of these sites that I'm going to be showing you in the same day, it's really important that you have like a schedule and you stick to it, because if you don't, you'll end up running out of time and you won't be able to see everything in the same day. You can see everything in the same day, but you have to have like a very organized, structured, kind of stay on schedule type of setup, so to speak. John Wilkes Booth rested here for several hours on April 15th, 1865, after receiving treatment for his broken leg. And here's some pictures from when we visited this site. So again, I've been to this house numerous times over the past several years. This was a pretty well-to-do house in this era. Dr. Mudd was a doctor. He also was a slave owner. He had a small plantation. The plantation aspect of his career or life, so to speak, was not the main source of his income. The fact that he was a doctor was, but he's a country doctor. There's not a lot of people living out in this area, so he can make some additional income by cultivating this property, so to speak. Here is the house. And then just wanted to give you a sense, when you go up to the front of the house, This is looking back out the other way. So picture you're kind of like at the front door and you're looking out. And I'm guessing that this 1950s era bungalow was not there when John Wilkes Booth was there. Same thing here. Now, even though this is daylight, you can just see there's not really much out here now in terms of like development. And so just imagine how tricky it might be to kind of find this place if it was dark out. And just some more images of the outside of the house. So pretty nice house. Dr. Mudd was not a millionaire or anything like that, but he was pretty well off during this point in time in his life. And like the Surratt house, they also have various historical programs, including living history programs and tour guides and period costumes. So this is when we came out one time, this woman was talking about the relationship the house had with John Wilkes Booth. And then kind of like the Surratt site that we saw earlier, I also like visiting here because again, it gives you a sense of, hey, here's what life was like in this part of the country in the mid 1800s. So give you a sense of that. Like getting your water from a well. These are just some pictures I took walking around the property. When I took these photos, I never envisioned showing them to anyone. They were just kind of for myself. This was before Zoom and COVID and all that stuff, of course, but it does give you a sense of how wide open space it is and how rural it is out here. And then here's the house over here. So during the time of the Civil War, when Booth would have been traveling through here, or I guess you could say the final stage of the Civil War, this would have been like fields that would have been cultivated by enslaved persons. They don't have it set up like that now, for the most part. And then just some other views of the home. Now, a lot of visitors come and see this site either around the anniversary of the assassination or during the summer tourist season. You can visit though at other times. So like for instance, this was a trip we made in October. It's not really didn't coincide with any particular anniversary, but you can see they had Halloween stuff set up. It was really pretty. This is a really beautiful part of the country. If you're not familiar with this section, the Mid-Atlantic area of the United States and Maryland in particular has some really beautiful scenery. Well, this was another living history program that they had, explaining what's going on in the house. It's also really cool to look at these period clothing items because sometimes they'll talk about why they chose the particular items that they're wearing and how clothing was the same or different than it is now. So that's also really fascinating. Okay, Dr. Samuel A. Mudhouse, circa 1830, placed on the National Register of Historic Places by the United States Department of the Interior, October 1st, 1974. Look at that. This plaque was set up in 1974, almost 110 years after the assassination of Lincoln. So that's noteworthy. And then here's the house, and look, if you study closely, you can see Booth here looking out the window at us, keeping an eye on things. And there he is. This is the Dr. Samuel A. Mudd House Society Incorporated. This talks about the history of the house. Like in particular, Dr. Mudd married his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Frances Dyer, on Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1857. As a wedding gift, his father gave him 218 acres. And then it kind of goes on to talk about stuff like that. So I'll let you read through that if you want. All right, I wanted to focus on this part, though. Following the assassination of President Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth fled from Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., stopping first to pick up supplies at the Surratt House in Prince George's County, Maryland, which was the site we just talked about. From there, he and his accomplice, David Harold, traveled south to Charles County, looking for medical assistance for Booth's leg, which he injured while escaping from Ford's Theater. David Harold told Booth that he didn't think they should stop, that they really need to keep going to get ahead of the Union cavalry that was surely going to be following them or on their tail, so to speak. So Harold did not think it was a good idea to stop. But of course, Booth, that's easy for him to say. He's not the one that's got the broken bone in his leg. But Booth was just really adamant that he couldn't take it any longer and he needed some kind of medical assistance. So at approximately 4 a.m. on April 15th, they arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, claiming to have falling off his horse. Booth received medical attention and remained here until the late afternoon. Da, 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 da. The reason why Mudd is such a controversial character is he claimed that he didn't recognize Booth, which a lot of people have a hard time believing because he had met John Wilkes Booth. He said, well, it was late at night and I was tired and it was dark and he didn't show his face, and et cetera, et cetera. And again, kind of similar to Mary Surratt. One reason why he's a controversial figure, some people think that he was not involved in the conspiracy to help Booth escape from killing Lincoln. And some people think they do. Again, my personal opinion from studying the facts is that he was guilty. But if you think that he was innocent, that's totally fine. I won't take it personally. But again, just a very controversial individual. One of the reasons why myself and a lot of other people think that he was guilty, just to give you a quick synopsis, is first of all, he had met Booth before, number one. Number two, he wasn't overly cooperative with the federal authorities after they started talking to him. And then his story changed a little bit, kind of like all the red flags that someone that was guilty would do. He did quite a few of them himself. So that's my opinion on that one. But the opinion that I would say most people have, but not all. So, and then this is the inside of it. It was a really beautiful home. Here's that photo that I showed you a minute ago over the mantle. So just a really beautiful home. I mean, look at this rug and the furniture. This is like an old school mid 1800s desk. You'd pull your chair up here and you have all your envelopes and papers and stuff like that, and right on here. And here's another view. Got the piano over here. And so it usually happens is you make arrangements ahead of time, like, I don't know, a week before or a month before, and say, hey, I'm going to be there on Saturday, whatever, May 12th. Can I get a tour at 1 o'clock? And they say, yeah, sure. And it's not very expensive. It's really, I don't remember the exact cost, but it's really affordable to go to the Surratt house, the Mudd house. They only charge a few dollars, and you get this really cool tour and all this history and things like that. So it's a great place to visit. There's the desk. Some old books. This is the dining room. Again, just really fascinating to see how people lived at this point in time, and the food they ate, how it was prepared and stuff like that. So this is the family dining room. And when you look at this house, again, you get a sense that he was pretty well to do, pretty well off financially. Of course, I'm sure being able to utilize the slave labor helped him in regards. This is a really beautiful piece of furniture here as well. And then you go upstairs, and this is the master bedroom. So this is Dr. Mudd and his wife's room. And again, just really beautifully furnished. And when you go do the tour, they stop and point out some of these interesting things, like This is a little bit later, I believe. There's a sewing machine and some prints on the walls and stuff like that. After Dr. Mudd was arrested, his wife continued to live here, although she really had a challenge trying to keep her head above water financially, so to speak. And then eventually he got out of jail and returned home, or I should say, got out of prison and returned home. And then here's the spare room. Guns on the wall, another desk, bookcase kind of set up with all these really interesting knickknacks, many of which were owned by the Mudd family. And then this is the room that Booth stayed in. So they show up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, as that historical marker indicated, and they end up staying here for quite a while, longer than Harold wanted to. So then the next morning breaks, and Booth is exhausted, and they decide to not travel during the day because they're worried about getting caught by the Union cavalry. So they pretty much stay all day the next day resting, and then they head out in the evening once it starts getting dark out. But this is the room that Booth was staying in with his broken leg. So Harold and Mudd had to help him up the stairs because he wasn't in a condition to get up the stairs by himself, because of course he's got the broken bone in his foot. Here's a couple of beds and the chamber pots, and they didn't have the same exact type of bed apparatus. They have these ropes that they would string across the bed, and then like the mattress would be on top of that. That's where the saying sleep tight comes from, because you wanted to have these ropes on your bed tight so that it didn't sag. So a little historical footnote for you. So Booth basically just crashes out here all day from exhaustion and trying to get recuperated from the broken bone in his leg. And then even though he murdered someone, got the Christian cross right here, which is ironic to say the least. And then Mudd gives him a crutch to use because he can't walk very easily. And so his mobility is really an issue for them. Up until this point in time, Booth has pretty much stayed in the saddle of his horse. So from the time he left Ford's Theater to the time he got to the Mudd house, which would have been about, let's see, 5 hours and 45 minutes later, approximately 6 hours, he hadn't gotten out of the horse. And so he's really having a hard time moving. He doesn't really need to move around all that much here, though, because they help him up the stairs. Then he pretty much just crashes out in the bed and gets some rest. But eventually he's going to be on his way. And so Mudd makes this device for him to use, this crutch. And then his leg was so swollen from the bone being broken that Mudd couldn't get his boot off of his foot and leg. It had to be cut off. And so it ended up getting left behind. And so when the federal authorities showed up, this was kind of like a smoking gun type of thing. It's like, well, yeah, obviously he was here, because you can't see it, but Booth's name was actually imprinted in his boot, so they knew it was him, and the boot got left behind. So that's interesting. And then the family of Dr. Mudd is honorably still trying to get his name cleared. So this was an article from 7 years ago. The family of Dr. Samuel Mudd still trying to unmuddy the name. Back in the summer of 2000, when I was a reporter at the Washington Post, I spoke to Dr. Richard Mudd of Saginaw, Michigan, who was 99 and still fighting to clear the name of his grandfather, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, who treated John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated President Lincoln in 1865. Just months before I spoke to him, the U.S. Army had rejected his bid to overturn the conspiracy conviction against his father. So Dr. Mudd was put on trial and he was convicted. Just as a historical footnote, I will fight until I'm dead, he told me by phone from his Saginaw home. I'm holding on day to day in hopes they exonerate my grandfather. So the family has tried to get his name cleared, so to speak, but they've been unsuccessful up until now. He died in May 2002 at age 101. The family name remained Mudd. Now, 13 years later, the campaign by family to clear the name goes on. It's still Mudd. So this is, you see this story pop up like every, I don't know, 2 or 3 years that there's like another attempt to get his name cleared, which is noteworthy, but they haven't been able to make any headway on that, so to speak. I personally, my thought is no one wants to touch this because there's just not enough evidence that he wasn't not guilty, and they're pretty much just rolling with the decision that the military tribunal made. And I thought this was interesting. Now, remember, Mudd was convicted of assisting Booth, the guy who assassinated the president of the United States. It's a fact. Mudd was convicted. Booth was the guy who killed Lincoln. Mudd was convicted for helping Booth. But that being said, in Maryland, they have the Dr. Samuel A. Mudd Elementary School. So I don't have any children, but if I ever do, I can assure you they won't be going to a school named after someone who helped the murderer of the president of the United States. All right, continuing, the next site that you can go to is really also very fascinating, but this one is not as many people go to because it's further away from Washington, D.C. It's a site called Rich Hill, and it's in a place called Belle Alton, Maryland. And here's our map, and here's where we are. So if you were to drive and leave Washington, D.C., I think when we do our bus tour, we leave like at 8 or 8:30. You drive for a ways out here. You stop at the Surratt Tavern, check things out, maybe pick up a quick lunch while you're in that area. Then you continue on to the Dr. Mudd house, look around there for a while, then continue on. Now, it's getting to be kind of like, I don't know, maybe mid-afternoon by the time you make it down here, if you're able to kind of coordinate your schedule. And here is Dr. Mudd's house. And here's where they're trying to get to, the Rich Hill farmhouse. And same thing, when they were traveling at night, it was so dark out. And this particular part of the state, Booth and Harold were not as familiar with. So they were in much more difficult circumstances by the fact that they weren't able to navigate as easily as they were up until now. And so they actually got lost once again, trying to get on their way. Again, it's pitch dark out. There's no street lights or iPhone assistance or anything like that, but you can see it's not too far away from the Mudd house. So if you're visiting like from Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, and if you can make it to the Mudd house, it's actually not too much further to get down to this site. And this is an even more rural area out here. And then here's the historical marker, Rich Hill, mid-18th century farmhouse with alterations after was home of Colonel Samuel Cox. This Southern sympathizer fed and sheltered fugitives John Wilkes Booth and David E. Harold. Before dawn on Easter Sunday, April 16th, 1865, following Booth's assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, Booth and Harold hid in woods until the night of April 21st, when Cox's foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, helped them escape across the Potomac to Virginia. Now, this is a part of the story that people aren't as familiar with. Like, a lot of people have heard of Dr. Mudd, or they've heard of Mary Surratt, but like, these people are definitely not household names. And so I'm not sure exactly why that is. Maybe just because their story isn't as interesting, or maybe because they're not as close to Washington, D.C., or I don't know. Now, remember back to the election of 1860, Lincoln did not have a lot of support in Maryland. There's less than 2.5% of the people voted for him. So there's a lot of people throughout the state that are not fans of President Lincoln, including the folks here at Rich Hill. So you have Samuel Cox. He's the owner of this property. And then his relative is Thomas Jones, and they're both Confederate sympathizers that really play an important role in assisting Booth. This historical marker, I'm kind of already talking about the stuff that's included here, but it is nice that when you go on this journey, if you're traveling by yourself and maybe you don't know as much about the Booth escape route as you'd like to, it's nice that they have these historical markers along the way to kind of fill you in on some of the details. This home has a lot of history to it, not just related to John Wilkes Booth. Here's some of the information related to that. We're going to stick to the Booth stuff, so we'll skip over that. And here's the home today. So it's in the process of being restored. And the last I heard, it was not open to the public usually. So the last time I saw this house right before COVID, the whole interior was pretty much gutted. So they have the outside structure, but it's not like you can go walk through and see furniture and rugs and china and stuff like that, like you could at the previous two homes you saw. You have this beautiful split rail fence here. This home was actually in a lot worse shape. There's a nonprofit organization called the Friends of Rich Hill, which has really done an incredible job of restoring this house. So they've gotten a lot of things accomplished on the outside or the exterior, but they still have quite a bit of work to do. As you can imagine, this is a very expensive and painstaking process. So they're doing a great job of moving it along. It'll probably take a little bit longer though, unless they get some kind of financial windfall to finish the rest of the work. And then here's the other side. So what happens is Booth and Harold show up at the Cox residence and they want to come crash out here. But Cox is leery about having them stay at his house. And so there's a little bit of a debate on whether or not he actually let them in the house or not. There's kind of conflicting reports on what actually transpired as far as whether or not Booth ever went inside of his house or not. They have this site open to the public, sometimes for like special events, like usually around the anniversary of the Lincoln assassination before COVID. They were having like a big annual event out here with different types of things taking place. And so Cox tells Booth that he can't stay in his home and spend the night, but he can sleep out in the woods. So that really upset Booth quite a bit because he was a city guy. Booth was. He wasn't into camping. He was used to staying at nice hotels and fancy homes and things like that. And so the thought of sleeping out in the woods was not something that he was really interested in doing, but he's got to do what he's got to do. This is the back kind of looking away from the house. And then, of course, there's a lot of historical markers. If you are going to be making this trip, you have to, ahead of time, get the route picked out and figure out where you're going and stuff like that. It's not like driving down interstate highway and there's like a big giant historical marker that says, you know, Graceland next exit or the Alamo turn left. They do have historical markers, but they're kind of spread out. And so you really need to know where you're where you're going if you've not been out here before. It really helps if you have maybe someone that can one person drive and the other person can maybe navigate. But you really kind of have to do the research ahead of time as to where exactly these exact spots are, because while they do have the historical markers there, if you're driving down the road, they not necessarily, once you get out to this area, they're not really clearly marked oftentimes. And then the other thing too, depending on what type of cell phone service you have, the reception out here can be a little bit shaky. At least it was before COVID. And so Booth and Harold end up having to sleep in the pine thicket, which is basically the fancy term to say that they were sleeping out in the woods. Uh, and that was described as the instrument of his punishment. So he's being punished for the fact that he shot Lincoln. And then just to read some of this historical marker, after assassinating President Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice David A. Harold fled Washington for Southern Maryland, a hotbed of Confederate sympathizers. After leaving the home of Dr. Samuel A. Mudd near Bryantown, Booth found a guide who brought them to the home of Samuel Cox. So he wasn't quite sure how to get here. They ran across some local guy and basically bribed him with some money to get taken to Cox's house. Cox agreed to place them in the care of friends in the Confederate underground. Remember, the war is still going on. Robert E. Lee has surrendered, but there's still fighting going on at this point in time. So keep that in mind. He sent them to a dense growth of pines a mile west of his house and enlisted his foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, to help them reach the Potomac River 2 miles further, etc., etc. And so this is what this area looks like. So, I mean, imagine sleeping out here for several nights in April, which in this part of the country can get pretty cold at night. So that would have been very challenging. They weren't able to bring a tent with them. They were told not to light fires because they might attract attention to the cavalry that were going to be out looking for them. So it was a really tough existence. And then remember, Booth's got the broken bone in his leg. So really challenging environment for them to be in. And while they're there, on a few different occasions, they could hear the cavalry charging through here. This area was under complete Union military control. And so whenever they heard a large group of horses with men shouting and yelling, and they can hear the clattering of the swords and stuff like that, they know it's the Union cavalry out looking for them. And so on a number of different occasions, they were able to hear the horses traveling past them. And they were concerned that at any moment, they were going to be sprung upon by people out looking for them, but that didn't happen, at least not at this particular point. But interesting that they did hear the cavalry go by on a number of occasions. And while Booth is hiding out here, the two things that he wanted the most was food, of course, and then he also wanted the newspapers. He was really interested in seeing the kind of the remember, he was an actor. He really kind of wanted the reviews, so to speak, of his performance. He was really shocked because he thought that this would be a well-received endeavor that he pursued, killing Lincoln. He thought that he would be hailed in the South as a hero, and he thought that even quite a few people in the North would be appreciative of what he did, because a lot of people thought Lincoln was a tyrant during the war for different things that he had been involved in. And so he was really shocked when he got the newspapers, and for the most part, North and South, widespread condemnation for his killing of Lincoln. So that was not the press coverage he was hoping to see, but that was one of the things he requested, was he wanted to see the newspapers that were being published. And then he kept kind of like a mini diary. I talked about this briefly in the other program, so I won't spend too much time on this. I did want to say, though, that this is a photo from the exhibit at Ford's Theater. Booth's diary, it's not like an official diary like Anne Frank's. It's kind of more like him just jotting notes in this book that he had. Booth's diary provides unique insight into the mind of Lincoln's killer. Booth expected to be hailed a hero, but instead he was condemned for his actions. And here's a quote from Booth. I struck boldly, not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted "Sic Semper" before I fired. In jumping, broke my leg. This is a noteworthy point because some people will tell the story that Booth broke his leg when he fell off his horse. He says it directly in a quote that he broke his leg when he jumped from the Ford's Theater presidential box. So if you've heard that before, that's not correct. He told Mudd that he broke his leg when he fell off his horse. That's where that story originates from, but that's not actually factual. I passed all of his pickets, rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. I can never repent it, though. We hated to kill. Our country, meaning the Confederacy, owed all her troubles to him, meaning Lincoln, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment, or otherwise his murder. The country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country. So it's noteworthy that he says, I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country, but yet he's running for his life. So a little bit of a contradictory statement there from Booth, but sometimes that happens. Now he's got to get across the Potomac River, and this is one of the big challenges of his journey, so to speak. He's got to get from Maryland to Virginia. So let's talk about that. And here's the river right here, the Potomac River. And so he's kind of bottled up right here. And there's actually, by this point in time, a few days have passed since Lincoln was killed. There's all these people out looking for him, mostly military, but some civilians as well. There's ships that are patrolling this area. They were doing that even before the assassination, but in particular, they're looking for Booth, thinking that he's probably going to be going south. And of correct, they were. So he's got to get across the river, and they don't have as many bridges in the United States as they do back then. So it's not like he can just run across the bridge like he could do during normal or modern times. And so remember these guys, Samuel Cox was the person to let him stay on his property. And then his foster brother, Thomas Jones, he was the guy that really helps Booth. He brings him food, and he's the guy who's going to try and figure out how to get Booth across the river. Thomas Jones was very savvy. He was doing Confederate agent activities himself. He was a lifelong resident of this area, knew all the kind of back roads and things like that. So he was a really valuable ally for Booth. And his plan is to kind of wait a few days and let the cavalry kind of manhunt, so to speak, pass by Booth, and then continue on south. Jones's thought was that eventually the people looking for Booth would kind of realize that he's not there, and they would kind of not give up completely, but just kind of give up looking that area, and then they would go search other areas. And so it would make it a little more easier to travel if he waited a few days. This conflicted with Booth, who really wanted to get going, but he trusted Thomas Jones, and he's like, okay, well, he's in charge. He's the one who's going to have to get us out of here. So I'm going to have to do with what he says. Eventually Jones says, we're going to put you on a boat and have you row across the river, which is what they end up doing. Now, this is what the area looks like now. There's a bridge there now that you can cross. This bridge, of course, was not there during Booth's time. But imagine you're over here on this side of the water, and you got to get over here. And again, there's not development out here, so it's really dark. There's not lights and stores and gas stations and stuff like that. So it's really going to be a challenge for them to get across the water, and neither Booth nor Harold were very familiar with boats, so that's going to be another problem for them. This is actually a newspaper account of them after Booth was captured, of him and Harold crossing the Potomac River. Interestingly enough, Booth made Harold row the boat. He never actually rowed it himself, or rowed it, I should say, sorry. So there's that. And then kind of similar to the Dr. Mudd house, what does this area look like at night? Well, here's another photo of the area, and as you can imagine, it's pitch dark out. So really going to be challenging for them to get across the river, and it actually ends up being somewhat of a disaster, because instead of crossing the river directly, because it was so dark out and because the currents and stuff like that, they actually, instead of just going straight across, they ended up kind of going, instead of south, they didn't have a compass that they could use because it was so dark out. So instead of going south, they actually ended up going west, and they're going long ways and a long ways. And I'm like, oh my God, what is taking so long? And then they finally come ashore here, and then come to find out, they were still in Maryland. They hadn't even crossed the river, which was very upsetting to both of them, as you can imagine. And then they were so exhausted from rowing across the river that they pretty much had to spend a day recuperating. So instead of crossing and being over into Virginia in one night, it took them like 36 hours, because they tried to cross, they didn't make it, they were exhausted from that ordeal, they had to rest for 24 hours, and then they tried a second time, and then eventually they made it across, but it took quite a while. Now, by the time they get down here, 9 days have passed, because remember, they kind of hung out in the woods here from April 16th to April 21st. Lincoln was shot the night of April 14th. So it took them a long time to get down here. And that's one of the keys to Booth getting captured, is it took him too much time to get away from Washington, D.C. Had he been able to move quicker, either because he didn't break his leg or he planned better or whatever, who knows, by this point in time, he might have been able to make it all the way down to North Carolina or Georgia or something. But because he's traveling so slow, that really one of the big kings that leads to his capture. Now, Booth was familiar with the John Brown incident. John Brown was the famous abolitionist who tried to lead a slave rebellion. This takes place in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Let's go off in a brief tangent for a minute or two and talk about this. Here's a portrait of John Brown. He famously tried to lead a slave uprising. it was crushed. He's put on trial, and he was executed. Now, the reason why this is important is because John Wilkes Booth was actually at the execution of John Brown that took place on December 2nd, 1859. This photo was actually found in John Wilkes Booth's sister's home. And historians know that he was there, and they think that this is him in the photo, although some people think it might be him back here. But he had this Booth had given this photo to his sister. There wasn't any captions or anything on it. So historians have just assumed that it's a picture of him at the John Brown execution. But because Booth saw what a spectacle this was, he himself decided that he was not going to be taken alive. He did not want to be put on trial and condemned the way John Brown was. So a little bit of a kind of another historical footnote for you. And Booth is eventually caught at Garrett's farm in a place called Port Royal, Virginia. Let's talk about how he actually finally gets captured. Remember, here's our map. Here's Washington, D.C. Booth is trying to get south. Had he not broken his leg, and or if he had planned better, by the time 12 days passed by, he could have perhaps gone down to North Carolina or Georgia, or who knows, he could have made it all the way to Mexico or Texas if he had traveled by train. It's not really certain, of course, what would have happened to him if he had not broken his leg or if he hadn't gotten caught at Garrett's farm. And remember, he spends a lot of time here. Now, if you want to drive from the Rich Hill farmhouse to Garrett's farm, it's a little bit of a travel, but you can make it. Now, there's another river that he has to cross. It's a river called the Rappahannock. And at this point in time, there's no bridges in this area. And this is another thing that really trips up Booth, so to speak. So at this point in time, they have ferries that will take you across the river. So suppose you're on this side and you want to get over the other side, you hire one of these ferries and you either ride your horse or your wagon or just get on board and it'll take you across. And so this is what Booth has to use to get across the Rappahannock. He's going to take a ferry. He thinks it is a little bit safer here because he's now in Virginia. He took the boat from Maryland to Virginia because that area was being patrolled by the Union Navy, much more so than the Rappahannock was. So that's why he takes a ferry here. At this point in time, Andrew Johnson, of course, is president. He's taken over for Abraham Lincoln. He's not really the one, though, that's leading the hunt for Booth. It's really Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and you have to give him a lot of credit. He pretty much took every single resource that was available to the United States government and the United States military in looking for Booth and the conspirators. So Edwin Stanton did a great job of kind of leading the hunt for Booth. These are the famous wanted posters that came out. May have seen these before. Look at the size of the reward, $100,000. Imagine how much money that would be in modern times. This is probably, I would think, when I think of wanted posters, one of the most famous wanted posters in history, the John Wilkes Booth one. Here's the full view. You can see Stanton's name down here, Edwin Stanton. And of course, Stanton and Johnson are utilizing the Union military to look for Booth. As the days go by, they learn more and more information about Booth. It's just a few hours after the assassination that they realize John Wilkes Booth was involved. And then as the investigation continues in the days that follow, they realize that other people are involved, like David Harold and things like that. Now, on Sunday, April 9th, just a few days before Lincoln was shot, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The reason why that's noteworthy is because in mid-April, there's a lot of Confederate troops that are on their way back home. And so this is not a photo of 3 troops that were involved with John Wilkes Booth. I'm just showing it to you because it's a famous photo of Confederate troops. But suffice to say that the Confederate army of Robert E. Lee and many other armies are on their way home. There's still fighting taking place, but a lot of the soldiers have put down their arms and they're going home. And so Booth and Harold, as they're traveling south, uh, they're going home. And at the same time, though, the Union cavalry is scouring the area looking for them. So it's going to be this big challenge of, are they going to be able to find him, or is he going to get away? Who's going to win? Of course, you know how the story ends. So back to this Rappahannock River crossing. So the Union cavalry shows up at the Rappahannock River crossing where this ferry is, and they ask the proprietors, have you seen two guys passing through here on horseback? One of them with a broken leg. And they say, and of course, they're feverishly looking for Booth, so they're not asking him on very friendly terms. They're armed. There's a lot of them. I think there was like 28 cavalry men showed up at this ferry and said, basically threatening them, like, have you seen anyone passing through here? Two guys on horseback, civilians, one of them with a broken leg. And so the people that ran the fair are like, yeah, actually, we did see two people like that. They probably were a little bit fearful for their lives, because if they would have lied to the cavalry, who knows what would happen to them. But they say that, yeah, there were these two guys that were traveling through here that were civilians, and one of them did seem to have an injured leg, and they were traveling with 3 soldiers from the Confederate Army. And it just so happens that we know who one of the soldiers were. And of course, the cavalry's like, who's the soldier? And so they tell him his name and where he lives. And so the cavalry goes down and tracks that guy down. They say they basically grab him in the middle of the night at the house where he's living, and says, where's those 2 civilians that you were traveling with? And he says, we dropped him off at Garrett's farm. They're like, oh, okay, good. Well, we're on our way there next. And they actually bring the guy with them. And they basically threaten him and tell him that if it's some kind of trap, that they're going to kill him. And so he probably believes that was a legitimate threat. And so he does travel with them off to Garrett's farm. But this Rappahannock River crossing that Booth took is really another one of the key things that ended up getting him tripped up. Let me go back for just a moment. Hold on a second. Someone asked a question. Pam had a question, so let me go back for a minute. Okay, so this is the Potomac River where they crossed by boat. This is the Rappahannock River, and it's hard to tell how wide this river is because this map, the scale of it, but you can't swim across or take a horse across this Rappahannock at this point in time. So Booth knows that he's going to have to take the ferry, but it's the ferry that really ends up, oops, sorry, let me go back. The screen was locked. Here's the Potomac River. They took the rowboat across. The Rappahannock River down here is where they took the ferry. And so that's what trips them up, because it was the ferry that told the Union cavalry that, yeah, there were these 2 guys that came through here, and they one of them had an injured leg. And oh, by the way, we know one of the soldiers that was accompanying them, and he lives a little ways down the road. And so the Union cavalry jump all over that, and they grabbed the guy that was traveling with Booth. It would just so happen that Booth encountered these Confederate soldiers and asked if he could travel with them, and they're like, yeah, whatever. They weren't involved in the assassination by any means. It just so happened that they crossed paths with one another. And then so the cavalry shows up at Garrett's farm because the Confederate soldiers told the Union cavalry that that's where they dropped off the 2 guys. And so the cavalry shows up in the middle of the night at Garrett's farm, and they drag the occupants of the farmhouse out of the house and say, where are the 2 guys that are staying here? And the people in the house are kind of conflicted as to what to do. There's kind of some debate back and forth, and they basically they threaten the occupants of the house, tell us where the 2 guys are, or bad things are going to happen to you. And so eventually they say, well, they're in the barn. And so this is kind of a whole nother long story. There was some kind of suspicion as to who Booth was, and who the other guy that was traveling with him. And so some of the people that were at the house thought they were suspicious. Some other people thought they were fine. There wasn't anything to worry about. But that discussion would take a little bit longer to go through. So let's just kind of skip over that, and suffice to say that eventually the Union cavalry is told that they're in the barn. Now, this is not the barn that Booth was in, because it was torn, or was burned down, and it was never replaced, but it was kind of a barn like this. So picture the Union cavalry, all of them, surrounding this barn at night with their guns drawn and yelling into the barn to Booth and his accomplice David Harold that, you're surrounded, we know you're in there, come out. And there's kind of some back and forth between Booth and the cavalry. Now, Harold wants to surrender. So Booth allows him to do so. He was kind of whimpering that he didn't want to be dealing with this anymore. And so off he went. Booth didn't want to surrender, though, because remember, he doesn't want to end up like John Brown and go on trial. And so he ends up having to figure out what he's going to do. I did forget to mention one thing. Let me go back and go through that before I forget. I forgot to mention that when they crossed the river, they didn't have their horses with them. They actually killed their horses when they were hiding out right before they crossed the river. The reason being was because you would not be able to take your horses in a boat that looked like this. And so Thomas Jones, the guy that was helping him, told him, listen, you guys have to kill your horses because you can't take them with you. And when you get to the other side, you're just going to have to figure out some way of transporting yourself. So they've never found, Harold actually shot the two horses in the forest and they were never recovered. So, the body's probably decomposed. But somewhere out in that forest is John Wilkes Booth's horse, but it's never been discovered. So wanted to include that. I forgot to mention that earlier. So how they get from the shore down to Garrett's farm is they basically have to rely on people giving them rides and wagons, and the Confederate soldiers help them along the way. So that's how they're able to kind of cover this ground from the shore down to Garrett's farm. They don't have their horses anymore, which is also something that's going to slow them up. And there really was not a lot of planning on Booth's part as to how he was going to escape. His initial decision when he decided to kill Lincoln was ended with that. He never really had time or the ability to figure out how he was going to escape from Washington after he shot Lincoln. So this part of the whole operation, this lack of planning and these time delays, was something that also really trips him up. Hold on for 1 second. Okay, so the cavalry has surrounded the barn at Garrett's farm. They feel pretty confident that Booth is the guy in there because, I mean, think about it. How many people are traveling through the Confederacy? 2 guys, one of them with a broken leg. So they kind of some negotiating going back and forth. Harold eventually gives himself up and goes outside. Booth is still in the barn. He's vowing to put up a fight. And so eventually what they do to try and flush him out is they light the barn on fire, thinking that that will force him out of the barn. They were the orders were to capture Booth alive, if at all possible. And so they really did not want to shoot and kill him if they didn't have to. They wanted to capture him alive so they could kind of learn more about the conspiracy. And while the barn is on fire, one of the Union soldiers thinks that he sees Booth in the light from the fire, raising up his gun like he's going to shoot it out of the barn and shoot at one of the soldiers. And before that can happen, he ends up shooting into the barn and killing Booth. This is a famous contemporary depiction of the event. So I just kind of remember this is the barn. It's in flames because they put it on fire to kind of flush Booth out, and just kind of picture the whole barn surrounded by Union cavalry. And so there's nowhere for Booth to go. And after he's shot, they see him fall to the ground through the slats in the barn. They rush in and grab him and drag him out. And then they drag him to the Garrett farmhouse porch. And he ends up living for a short time before he dies of his gunshot wound. He was shot in the neck. And if you're wondering what was the last thing that Booth said before he died, he was looking at his hands. And for whatever reason, his final words looking at his hands were useless. useless. So those were the final 2 words of John Wilkes Booth. And the guy that killed him was named Boston Corbett. He also a really fascinating individual. If we'd had more time, we would talk about all the different things that he was involved in. Very interesting, eccentric individual, but he's the guy who shot John Wilkes Booth, thinking that Booth was going to fire outside the barn. And here's where the final stop on our bus tour that we take is. It's the site where Booth died. This is the historical marker about a mile up the road on this road. 2 miles south is the Garrett place. There, John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin, was found by Union cavalry and killed while resisting arrest. And so when you go to this site, which if you want to do like the whole Booth escape route trip, you have to go all the way down here. You can just go to like the Surratt place or the mud place, but if you want to do like the whole thing, you should also go to Rich Hill. And then this particular site, there's unfortunately not a museum here, though. It's really just a historical marker on the side of the road with these woods here. So the Garrett farmhouse is no longer standing. The barn was burned down. It was never replaced. And so they don't have a museum or anything here. This is actually government property. This is a military installation. And so I think that they probably just aren't crazy about people coming here, but they know that so many people want to do it. But if you Google, like, I don't know, Booth assassination or Booth place where Booth was killed, there's all this, like, people make the pilgrimage here all the time. So it's not uncommon. This was one of our, I think this was our first trip we took out here with our group. So what we would do in past is we'd rent one of these 15 passenger vans, and then we'd all pile in the van from Washington, DC, and down we go. And then here's the historical marker, basically indicating this is the spot where Booth life came to an end. This is the site of Locust Hill, Richard Henry Garrett's farm. Early on the morning of April 26, 1865, a 16th New York Cavalry Detachment cornered John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln, and his co-conspirator David E. Harold, as the 2 men slept in Garrett's tobacco barn. Harold gave himself up, but Booth refused to surrender. The barn was set on fire, and Sergeant Boston Corbett shot the assassin, still inside. Booth was laid on the porch of the Garrett house and died about sunrise. The house and barn stood a short distance from this spot, so neither one is still there. And he was killed on April 26, 1865, or 12 days after the assassination. And so this kind of gives you a sense of what this area looks like. So this is what I was talking about before, where if you are going to be visiting these sites, it's pretty easy to do. You just have to do the research ahead of time, because you don't want to be driving down the road and like trying to find this spot while you're driving, because it's, again, another rural area. So it's very doable. It just takes a little bit of preparation before you depart to make things easier. And we talked about John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor, Southern sympathizer, had very extremist political views. He was a racist, and he also blamed Abraham Lincoln for the South's misery and suffering. Okay, a few more things about the story, and then we'll call it a night. When the cavalry captured Booth, they were pretty sure it was him, but of course, they weren't 100% sure. So they dragged his body back to Washington, D.C., where he was examined, and it was determined that it was actually him. There's quite a few conspiracy type theories floating around that it wasn't actually John Wilkes Booth that was killed. The last website that I saw that had that information, it was, if you go to the website, it has the Booth conspiracy theory on one side of the website, and then the other section has a thing about the moon landing being faked, and then below that is one about the Earth being flat. So that's my thoughts on that. So with Booth out of the picture, when they end up having the trial for the Lincoln conspirators, obviously he doesn't go on trial because he's dead. And there were several conspirators that were put on trial. These were the 4 main ones that they were found guilty and sentenced to death. the conspirators trial took place in Washington, D.C. It's actually a site that you can visit periodically. Before COVID, they would have the site open like 3 or 4 times a year. So imagine this like major trial taking place. It was a military trial, which was very controversial. It was not a civilian trial. Edwin Stanton made that decision. He basically didn't want the drama of a civilian trial. And so he basically thought this was a war crime type of situation. And so the conspirators were put on trial in front of a military court. And here's some images of that. And again, you can visit this site in person today. It's not open all the time to the general public, but before COVID, they would periodically have like an open house every, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a year. You want to go check it out. These are actually the people that were involved. And they're found guilty, most of them, and 4 of them were sentenced to death. And of course, there was a tremendous amount of media coverage. If you thought the O.J. Simpson trial was the trial of the century, or the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial was the trial of the century, no, this one was the original trial of the century. And here's a black and white photo that was colorized, and you can see them at the gallows. So they built this scaffolding kind of contraption just specifically for this purpose. They're putting the hoods over their heads, and here's the nooses. If you are a little bit squeamish, turn away from your computer for the next 20 seconds or 15 seconds, because here's after the platform was removed, and of course they died. And the trial was very quick. The deaths of these 4 conspirators took place on July 7th, 1865. And remember, the assassination was on April 14th. I mentioned it in the first program. I don't think I did so in this one. So Lincoln was shot on the night of April 14th, and a little bit after 10 o'clock p.m. He died on the morning of April 15th. So sometimes you'll see the April 14th date used. Sometimes you see the April 15th date. Depends on what context it is. And if you're wondering what happened to this spot where the Booth conspirators were executed, well, it's now a tennis court. Imagine that. So there's a guy holding a photo of the event taking place on the tennis court that's there now, interestingly enough. People frequently ask me during or after these types of programs if there's any books that I recommend in this subject. And yeah, there's a lot of them, but my 2 favorite ones are these 2. They Have Killed Papa Dead was written by my late great friend Anthony Pitch. He was a local author and historian who unfortunately passed away a while back. His excellent book is called They've Killed Papa Dead. His book has more to do with the overall assassination. And then another great book was written by local author James Swanson. It's called Manhunt. And his book actually was what prompted us to go take this bus trip, because we were reading it for our history book discussion. And we decided, gee, it'd be really cool to go visit these sites in person. And so I think that was like in 2016 or something like that. So Swanson's book actually led to us organizing these bus trips. And then if you joined us late, we periodically do tours of Ford's Theater and talk about the Lincoln assassination. Those are on hold because of COVID, but hopefully start back up at some point in time in the future. As I mentioned previously, if you want to know more about Mary Surratt and the trial and all that stuff, I was going to stream or screen this film, The Killing of Mary Surratt, and I was going to do it sometime around the anniversary of the trial. So I guess that'd be considered like part 3. And so we'll do that like in the summer of later on this summer, probably like in late June or early July. I'll send out a notice for that if you want to join us. And I would really just be curious when you see the film and learn more of Mary Surratt, whether or not you think she was guilty or if you think she was innocent. Again, I think she's guilty or was guilty. If you think that she was innocent, that's totally fine. And this has been the Lincoln Assassination Conspirators and Booth Escape Route Tour. Just wanted to give you kind of like a online or a virtual experience, since we can't go visit these places in person. I also mentioned that this is part 2 of our program. Part 1 was the Abraham Lincoln Assassination Ford's Theater Tour. If you missed that, or if you want to watch it again, that program and this one are on our YouTube channel, which is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. And then last November, if you're interested in presidential assassination type stuff, we had a program on the Kennedy assassination, including what was John F. Kennedy doing in Texas? Where did him and Jackie go before the assassination? All that kind of stuff. What were they doing the last night together in the White House? All that kind of stuff. So if you want to check that out, that's on our YouTube channel. I posted the link for that in the chat. We're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. We try and keep all the programs that we do free. The reason why we're able to do so is because people are periodically generous enough to make donations to support the work we do. If you've ever made a donation to support our programs, thank you very much. We could not continue to pay our Zoom bill and our Meetup website and our email costs and things like that without contributions from the community. So thank you very much. If you'd like to make a donation in the future, you can do so by PayPal, Venmo, or GoFundMe. And that's the end of our program. So thank you very much. Hope you learned a little bit about the really interesting ordeal of John Wilkes Booth trying to escape justice after he murdered the great Abraham Lincoln. He did not make it, of course, and he was captured and killed. And the reason why we have this program this time of year is because it's the anniversary of the death of Abraham Lincoln, April 15th, 1865. So that concludes our program. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me do this. Someone asked if I could show the Surratt house video again. And yes, I can. So let's see, hold on and I'll do that. But first, let me stop the recording.